Every single day, millions of retired Americans are typing the same question into Google. Is the $2,000 stimulus real? And am I going to get it? Here's the truth. Nobody is giving you straight. President Trump publicly promised on Truth Social that Americans would receive a dividend of at least $2,000 a person, not including high-income people. That sounds exciting. But here's what the mainstream media keeps burying in the fine print. The entire funding source for that $2,000 comes from tariff revenue. And right now, the U.S. Supreme Court is deciding whether those very tariffs were even legal in the first place. Legal experts warn that if the court rules against the tariffs, up to 75% of that projected revenue disappears overnight, and so does the money meant for your check. On top of that, Congress hasn't passed a single law authorizing any payment. The IRS has confirmed nothing. The Treasury Secretary himself said it might not even be a check. It could come as tax cuts instead. So before you make any financial decisions based on headlines flooding your feed, you need the full picture, because what happens in that courtroom directly affects your wallet. Now, here's where things get really important for you to understand, because this is not just politics and it's not just a courtroom drama playing out in Washington. This directly affects whether you ever see a single dime from that $2,000 promise. So let's walk through this step by step, calmly and clearly, because you deserve the full truth and not the cherry-picked version being sold to you on social media. Let's start at the very beginning. Back in November 2025, President Trump posted on Truth Social and said, and this is his exact promise, that a dividend of at least $2,000 per person, not including high-income people, would be paid to everyone. He doubled down on it the very next day and said that whatever money was left over after those payments would be used to, quote, substantially pay down the national debt. He repeated this idea at a cabinet meeting in December, calling 2026 the largest tax refund season of all time. He said it again in a New York Times interview when pressed about timing, telling the reporter that the tariff money is so substantial that he'd be able to do $2,000 sometime, and he pointed toward the end of the year. That is the promise. That is what he said. And millions of Americans, including a lot of seniors on fixed incomes who are struggling with grocery bills and Medicare costs, heard that and thought, finally, some real relief is coming. And honestly, that reaction makes complete sense. But here is where the story gets complicated, and this is the part that most YouTube videos and news segments either skip over or gloss past in 10 seconds. The entire financial foundation for that $2,000 promise was built on one thing and one thing only: tariff revenue. Specifically, the billions of dollars being collected every single month from those sweeping import taxes that Trump imposed on goods coming in from China, Mexico, Canada, and dozens of other countries. The government was pulling in roughly $30 billion a month from those tariffs at the peak. Trump called it a windfall. He called it a national security bonanza. And he told the American people that all of that money was going to come back to them. Here's what you need to know about where that money was coming from and why it matters right now. Trump did not go through Congress to impose those tariffs. He used a 1970s law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which most people just call IEPA. This law was written to give presidents emergency economic powers during genuine national security threats. Trump declared that America's trade deficit, the gap between what we import and what we export, was a national emergency. He also pointed to fentanyl flowing across borders as another justification. Based on those declared emergencies, he used IEPA to unilaterally impose massive tariffs, some as high as 145% on Chinese goods, 25 to 35% on Canada, and a baseline of at least 10% on almost every other country in the world. He called it Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025. It made international headlines, markets panicked, and then the legal challenges started pouring in. Businesses sued, states sued, a toy company, importers, trade groups, they all went to court arguing that the president had no legal authority to do what he just did. And here's the thing. They had a very strong argument because the United States Constitution is actually very specific about this. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress, and Congress alone, the power to impose taxes and tariffs on imports. That is not the president's power to take. The president can ask for it, and Congress can grant it through law. But Trump did not go through Congress. He did it on his own using an emergency declaration. And the law he used, i.e. EPA, does not even contain the word tariff anywhere in its text. Not once. That one fact was extremely important in the legal battles that followed. The cases worked their way through the courts fast. A federal trade court ruled the tariffs were illegal. Then the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, in a 7-4 decision, also said the tariffs were unlawful. Both courts said Trump had exceeded his authority. Then the Supreme Court agreed to take the case on an expedited basis, which means they knew this was urgent. Oral arguments happened in November 2025, and during that hearing, something very revealing happened. Even the justices that Trump himself appointed, people like Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, were pressing the administration's lawyer with sharp, skeptical questions. Justice Barrett asked whether every country in the world really needed to be tariffed because of threats to the defense and industrial base. Justice Gorsuch questioned whether Congress could even constitutionally hand over such sweeping authority to the president at all. That's a big deal. When your own appointees are questioning you that hard during oral arguments, it tells you something about where things are headed. And then today, February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court handed down its ruling, 6-3. The court struck down Trump's sweeping emergency tariffs. Chief Justice John Roberts, who was appointed by a Republican president, wrote the majority opinion. He was joined by the 3 liberal justices plus 2 of Trump's own picks, Gorsuch and Barrett. Roberts wrote that the president had claimed the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope, and that to claim that kind of power, he must be able to point to clear congressional authorization. And Roberts said he could not, because Congress never gave it to him explicitly. The court made clear that when Congress grants tariff powers, it does so clearly and with careful constraints, and those conditions were not met here. The ruling specifically struck down all tariffs imposed using IEEPA, the Liberation Day tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, the China fentanyl tariffs, all of it. Gone. Legally invalidated. Now, when the ruling came down, Trump was furious. He held a press conference at the White House and delivered one of the sharpest rebukes of the Supreme Court that any president has ever given publicly. He called the decision a disgrace to our nation. He called the justices in the majority very unpatriotic and disloyal to the Constitution. And then, and this part is important, he singled out Gorsuch and Barrett, the 2 justices he personally appointed who voted against him, and said they are, frankly, a disgrace, and that it was an embarrassment to their families. That is a sitting president publicly attacking his own Supreme Court picks. That tells you how significant this ruling is and how much was riding on it. So now let's bring this all the way back to your $2,000, because that's why you're watching this, and you deserve a direct answer. The government, as of last December, had collected approximately $130 billion in tariff revenue, specifically from IEEPA tariffs, the ones that were just struck down. That was the money Trump was pointing to when he talked about sending you $2,000. That was the pot of funds he said would fund the dividend checks. And analysts at Yale's Budget Lab had already pointed out that even $200 to $300 billion per year in total tariff revenue would not be nearly enough to send $2,000 to every eligible American, which would cost somewhere around $600 billion. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget calculated it even more bluntly. Annual $2,000 dividends would increase the national deficit by $6 trillion over 10 years. So the math was already shaky before today. Now, with the Supreme Court ruling, the money source that Trump was relying on has been legally invalidated. But here is where it gets even more complicated, Because the ruling does not mean the government has to immediately write refund checks to importers or that everything collapses overnight. Justice Kavanaugh, who dissented, pointed out that the government might be required to refund billions of dollars to importers who paid the IEEPA tariffs. And the majority opinion said nothing about how or when those refunds should happen. So there is now a whole new layer of legal and financial chaos sitting on top of an already messy situation. Trump himself announced at his press conference that he is planning to impose a 10% global tariff using different legal authority, not IEEPA, but other statutes that the court did not touch. He said he's going to go in a different direction, maybe even stronger than the original approach. So tariffs are not completely gone, but the massive revenue engine that was generating $30 billion per month has just been turned off by the nation's highest court. And here's what that means for your $2,000 in plain language. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had already started walking back the cash check idea weeks ago. He said on national television that the dividend could come in lots of forms and lots of ways, and then listed things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security benefits, and deductibility of auto loan interest. Those are tax policy changes, not checks in your mailbox. White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett told CBS News that Congress is going to have to send that money to people and that the president would need to bring a proposal to Congress. That proposal has never been formally introduced. Not as a bill, not as a budget line, nothing. Even before today's ruling, the $2,000 was already shifting from a check to a concept. There is also the political reality to face. Some Republican senators and representatives were already skeptical of the idea, saying stimulus-style payments fuel inflation and worsen long-term economic stability. Senator Josh Hawley, one of the few who tried to legislate something close to this, introduced what he called the American Worker Rebate Act of 2025, which proposed a much smaller amount, somewhere between $600 and $1,400 for families, not individuals. That bill has not passed. The much larger $2,000 per person proposal has never even been formally written into legislation. And now, with the tariff revenue base being struck down, any congressman who was already hesitant has even more reason to say no, or to wait. The Wall Street rallied on the news of the ruling, which tells you that markets believe the tariff dismantling is better for the economy long term. But it also signals that the fiscal landscape Trump was counting on has fundamentally changed. Here is the bottom line for you as a senior living in the United States and trying to make smart decisions about your budget and your future. As of this moment, today, February 20th, 2026, there is no $2,000 check. There is no legislation passed. There is no IRS announcement. There is no Treasury Department distribution plan. The funding source that was supposed to pay for it has just been struck down by a 6-3 Supreme Court decision. The administration says it's committed to the idea but has no formal plan. Congress has not voted on it. And the president himself admitted in a live television interview just weeks ago that he hadn't actually made the commitment yet. Those are facts. Cold, documented, verifiable facts that you can look up from the same sources we're referencing right now. You should never make a financial decision, not adjusting your Social Security budget, not delaying a medication purchase, not changing your spending habits, based on a check that has not been authorized, not been funded, and not been scheduled. That is the honest truth, and you deserve to hear it clearly. What you should be paying attention to going forward is the congressional calendar, because that's where your answer actually lives. If Trump puts forward a formal legislative proposal for some form of tariff dividend or stimulus payment, and if Congress passes it, then the conversation becomes real. Until that happens, everything else is a promise, not a policy. Watch for bill numbers. Watch for Senate votes. Watch for IRS announcements at irs.gov, which is the only official source you should trust for information about any payments that could affect you directly. Because the difference between a president talking about a check on Truth Social and a check actually arriving in your bank account is a very long road through Congress, and right now that road hasn't even been paved.